Hello guys, welcome to the Springs and Hibernate tutorial part 17. In the last tutorial, we have done some practice activity, that is dependency injection with XML configuration. So in this tutorial, we will be learning about bean scopes. Okay, so this tutorial is about bean scopes. Springs and Hibernate tutorial part 17, bean scopes. Write some code. We'll get hands-on. We'll write some code. Okay. So basically, what is a Spring Bean scope? The first point, that is, scope refers to the life cycle of a bean. Bean, it is just an object. Okay. In a Spring context, we are calling it as a bean. It is just an object or instance. Scope refers to the life cycle of a bean. Second point, so how long does the bean live? How long does the bean live? That is the second point. Then third point, how many instances are created, or how many objects are created? Fourth point, how is the bean shared? Okay. How is the bean shared? So I'll just write it down. Scope refers to the life cycle of a bean. Scope refers to the life cycle of a bean. Second point, how long does the bean live? That is the question. How long does the bean live? Okay, in the Spring environment, or in that particular project that we are working on. The third point, that is, how many instances are created, or how many objects are created? How many instances are created? Right. So then, how is the bean shared? Okay. So we can share the bean. How is the bean shared? How is the bean shared? So here in the previous tutorials, we have seen that how we can define a bean in the Spring configuration file. So let me just open the application context.xml. Here you can see that the beans that we have used, right? So for example, let's say we have this my fortune service, right? That is a bean. Now by default, this bean scope, it is the singleton. Okay, by default it is the singleton bean scope. So what is the singleton bean scope? So this is the singleton bean scope, whether we give it or not. Okay, so we can give like by using some property, that is a scope. Okay, so here we can just say like scope is equal to, within the double quote we can specify that singleton. Okay, whether we specify it or not, it is the singleton scope. By default it is singleton scope. So what is the singleton scope, right? What is the singleton scope? What is the singleton scope? Spring container creates only one instance of the bean by default. Spring container creates only one instance of the bean. That is by default. Okay, whether we give the scope or not, by default Spring container creates only one instance of that particular bean. So basically it is cached in the memory. It is cached in memory. Another point in the singleton scope, that is all requests for the bean, all the requests for that bean will return a shared reference to the same bean, will return a shared reference. Okay, so will return a shared reference to the same bean, right? So these are the 3 points in case of singleton scope. That is, Spring container by default creates only one instance for that particular bean. Second point, it is cached in memory. It is cached in memory. The the bean, okay, the bean that has been created by the Spring container, that is cached in the memory. Third point, that is all requests for the bean, for that singleton bean, okay, will return a shared reference. Okay, will return a shared reference to the same bean. Okay, to the same bean. There won't be any new instances are created. Okay, it will be returning the shared reference to the same bean. Okay, so for example, in this case, we can we have seen that if I give like scope is equal to singleton, okay, like this. So this is the singleton bean, and we can give it also, or we can remove it. So by default, it is the Spring container creates only one instance. Okay, by default, the Spring container creates only one instance for that bean by default. So it is cached in the memory. All the requests for this bean, all the requests for this bean shared. Okay, all the requests for this bean will be returning a shared reference. Okay, will be returning a shared reference to the same bean. Basically, the reference is pointing to the same bean. That is what it happens. So if two beans, if two requests are requesting for the same bean, if two requests are requesting for the same bean, so it will return a shared reference. Means there won't be any new objects are created, but um, a reference, like two references are pointing to the same bean, or two references are pointing to the same instance or same object. And we have some additional Spring Bean scopes. Okay, we have some additional Spring Bean scopes apart from Singleton. So what are those? Additional Spring Bean scopes. So Singleton, we have seen Singleton, that is create a single shared instance of the bean. Create a single shared instance of the bean. Creates a single shared instance of the bean. So that is the default scope. Another bean scope we have, that is prototype. A prototype. So what does it do? So it creates a new bean instance. Creates a new bean instance for each container request. for each container request. So in this prototype bean scope, it will be creating a new bean instance for each container request. In case of Singleton, so whatever the requests that it receives, it will be only creating a single instance. Okay, but it will be of shared. Okay, the reference will be of shared. There won't be creating any new object or new instances. Only one instance, but shared instances of the same bean. Okay, that is a default scope. In case of prototype, creates a new bean instance for each container request. So how many times the container will request, that many different objects will be created. Okay, creates a new bean instance for each container request. It will be creating a new bean instance for every container request. Another one we have, that is request. What does it do? That is scoped to an HTTP web request. Scoped to an HTTP web request. So this one only used for web apps. Only used for web applications. Another we have, that is session. Okay, session. So this one is scoped to an HTTP web session, and of course it is also used only for web applications. Another bean scope we have, that is global session. Global session. Global session. So it is similar to this session, that is scoped to an scope to a global HTTP web session. Global HTTP web session. So this as well only used for web apps. Only used for web apps. So in this our write some code session, or write some code uh, tutorial part, we will be learning about these two, singleton and prototype bean scopes. Okay. Okay, like um, this is the overview of the bean scopes that we are going to learn. Especially we are going to concentrate on only two bean scopes, that is singleton, and the second one is prototype. Singleton and prototype. So we will write some code now. The first thing what we are going to do here, we will be creating a new configuration file for this project. We can have multiple configuration file for the same project, but whichever we want, we can refer to it. We can have multiple configuration files in the same project. According to our requirement, we can refer that configuration file. So here we have already created one configuration file, or we have already one configuration file, that is application context.xml. I'm copying this configuration file, right click and choose copy. So here itself you can right click and choose paste. So the name of this newly created configuration file, that is bean scope dash application context.xml. Bean scope dash application context.xml. I'm removing application context 2. So the name of the configuration file that we are creating newly, that is bean scope dash application context.xml. Click on OK. So whatever the content we have in the previous configuration file, all the content will be pasted into the newly created configuration file. So here we are removing some of the contents, and we're only keeping whatever the things we do need for this tutorial. So I'm removing this that we have done in the previous tutorial, and this one as well, defining the dependency, that is my fortune. Okay, this one, and I'm deleting this cricket coach entirely. So this is the content we do have here, this much only. So what is the next step here? To test it out, okay, to test this scope, okay, right now we are learning about the default scope, okay, default scope, whether we give it or not. The Spring container will be creating a single instance for the bean request, okay, for the particular bean request. So for to test it out, we'll be doing something called we are creating a class first initially to test it out. We are creating a driver class. Right click on the package, highlight new, select class. What is the name of the class? The name of the class we are going to give, that is beanscope demo app.java. Beanscope demo app, and we are eliminating .java because internally it will be considering as the Java file. And here we do need the public static void main. Okay, we are testing it out, so that is why I'm making sure that we do have the main method by clicking on this checkbox and hit the finish button. So in all the previous tutorials, we have seen that in the driver class, we are having these 4 steps. That is, load the Spring configuration file. That is the first step. Second one, retrieve bean from the Spring container. That is second. Third one, that is call the methods on the bean. Okay, call the methods that we have created. So the final one, that is close the context. First one, load the Spring configuration file. Second one, retrieve bean from the Spring container. Third one, that is call the methods, call the newly created methods. And the fourth one, that is close the context, right? So in this case, we have something different, right? Something different, like one more step we will be doing. So first step, that is load the Spring configuration file. I'm deleting this auto-generated code. The first step, that is load the Spring configuration file. How we can do that? That is class path XML application context. So the reference is context is equal to new class path XML application context. Here we are supplying the configuration file that we are about to refer, that is beanscope hyphen application context.xml. Beanscope hyphen application context.xml. We can resolve this red mark by just right clicking on this, or you can just highlight this, not the right click. It is just we should point the mouse on top of this red mark, and you'll be getting the suggestion, that is to import this class from the appropriate package. Can select this option to import this class. Now the red mark is gone. We have finished our first step, and the second step, that is to retrieve bean from the Spring container. Retrieve bean from the Spring container. How we can do that? That is creating a reference for the coach. The reference variable, that is the coach, is equal to context dot get bean method. I'm calling get bean. Inside this we are passing two arguments, right? The first one is the ID, that is my coach, right? My coach. So you can go to the configuration file. Here is the ID, right? That is my coach. That is the ID for the track coach class. So the ID, that is my coach, and the name of the interface, that is coach dot class. Once again, we are making a request, right, to get the bean. This is where we can find out that whether the Spring container, creating one instance or more than one instance for the same bean request. Coach, the coach, is equal to context dot get bean, and here we are supplying two arguments, that is one is my coach for the same class. We are making another request. Okay, this is the name of the interface, coach dot class. So here, instead of the coach, we will keep it as alpha coach. Okay, we should change the reference because we cannot have the same reference. Reference name should be different, but both the references can point to the same object. Alpha coach, alpha coach. That is the step. That is the code we have to do for the second step, that is retrieve bean from the Spring container. What about the third step? We do have that is check if they are the same. Okay, we are checking that the two references are pointing to the same object or not. Check if they are same. How we can do that? I'll just create a Boolean variable, that is a result. We are going to store the result in the Boolean format, that is true or false. So here I'm comparing these two. The coach double equals to alpha coach. Ending this statement with a semicolon. So next we are printing out the result. print out the result. A little Eclipse trick that we know, that is SYSO, press Control Enter to get the entire statement. So here what I'm doing is creating a new line by using this escape sequence backslash n. Okay, it will create a new line, right? So then having this text, that is whether these two references are pointing to the same object, pointing to the same object. So I'll be printing the result. So next, another statement, we will just print the memory location of the object. So here as well, I'm keeping the new line. And what is the memory location? Memory location for the coach. So here the coach, I'm just directly supplying the variable. What happens in this case, it will return something like class name at the rate some hash code. Okay, it will return class name at the rate the memory address of that particular object. That is what we get, the memory address. By default, it will return the memory address. So it will internally calling the toString method of the object class. Whenever we are trying to print directly the reference, internally it is calling the toString method of the object class. Then how the toString method got overridden by default, that is to return the memory address, okay, instead of the content. It just returns the memory address, okay, instead of content. So then for the alpha coach, we'll be finding out the memory location, whether this reference is pointing to the same instance or not. Alpha coach. Alpha coach, right? So save it. And one more step, that is our last step, that is to close the context, right? So to avoid some problems, we should always follow some procedures. So here, as the procedure, we are closing the context. Close the context. How we can close the context? That is context dot close. Context dot close. All right, we are ready to go. Save it, and here take a look in the configuration file that we did not specify any of the scope for this bean. Okay, we did not specify any of the scope, that is, it is default scope. Okay, so it is the default scope, that is Singleton Scope. Singleton Scope. In the Singleton Scope, the Spring container will be creating one instance for the same bean request. Okay, only one instance will be created and it will be shared. Okay, the reference will be shared, but only one instance will be created for the bean request, for the same bean request, for the particular bean request. It might be of any times. Okay, it might be of any times. Here you can observe we are requesting to get the bean 2 times. Okay, that is what we are doing, right? We are trying to call the same bean 2 times. So here it is of the Singleton scope, that is a default scope. We have not specified any scope, so it is of Singleton scope. So let's check it out whether these two references, that is the coach and alpha coach, are pointing to the same object. Right click anywhere on the bean scope demo app.java, highlight run as, select Java application. So what we are getting, the result. I'm maximizing this console window. Pointing to the same object, yes, it is true, because by default it is singleton. By default, it will be creating only single instance and it will be shared among the references. The request for the same bean, if it is more than once, it will be only creating only one instance and that reference will be shared with the references. Okay, only the references will be sharing. Same instance reference will be sharing to the one or more requests for the same bean. And you can observe here what we are getting, the class name, right? Track coach at the rate some memory address in the hexadecimal form. Okay, this is the memory location, memory address of that particular instance. And here as well, track coach at the rate 64729B1E. So this is the memory address and these two are matches, right? So these two are matches. So we can come to the conclusion that both the references are pointing to the same instance, right? There won't be a new instance created by the Spring container for the same bean request. So now here what we will do is we will explicitly give the scope. How can we do that? That is in the bean, sorry, not here, that is in the track coach. Okay, that is my coach. Here scope is equal to, within the double quote, singleton. This is the scope we would like to give. Save it and you can now check it out whether we are getting the same output or result as the previous run, or are we getting any new result? Come to the bean scope demo app.java, right click, run as Java application. I'm maximizing this window, and here as well you can see that it is pointing to the same object. Yes, it is pointing to the same object. Two references are pointing to the same object, and how we can sure about that? We are printing it out right at the memory location of the instance that is it is pointing to. These references are pointing to. So trackhouse at the rate this hexadecimal address, and here as well these two matches, right? These two memory address matches. So we can come to the conclusion that two references are pointing to the same object, right? So the first conclusion, that is whether we give it or not the scope, by default it is singleton. And second point, if we are giving it as the scope as singleton, we will be getting the same result as if we do not give the scope at all. So now why don't we check it out by giving the scope as prototype? Here we'll just say prototype, right? Prototype. So what happens in this case? I'm just changing the scope to the prototype. Save it, come to the bean scope demo app.java, right click, run as Java application. So here you'll be getting the clarity. Here you'll be getting the difference between singleton and prototype. The scope we have used, that is the scope we have used, that is prototype. In that case, what happens? Two instances are created, okay, for the different requests for the same bean, okay. The Spring container will be creating a different instance for different requests for the same bean, right? So here we have the prototype description: creates a new bean instance, create a new bean instance for each container request. So that is why we are getting the result as false, right? How you can sure about that? That is these two references are pointing to the different instances. That is, first one, trackouch at the rate some hexadecimal memory address, and you can compare the first one. You can compare the first one with the second one. Here trackouch at the rate 10 BBD20A, something different than other reference. That is, these two are pointing to the different instances. These two references are pointing to the different instances. So the Spring container, right? So the Spring container. In this case, for the request, for the different request, for the more than one request for the same bean, okay, creates a new bean instance, creates a new bean instance for the different instances, sorry, for the different requests, for the different requests. In this case, we are uh, we are trying to get the bean two times, right? Get bean one time, get bean second time. So two instances, two requests. So that is why it is creating two new instances, right? And these two instances are totally different. And if we are comparing these two instance references, so obviously these two are totally different. These two references are pointing to the different instances. That is why we are getting false, and that is why we are getting the different memory address for the track coach object or instance, right? So these two are pointing to the different object. That is why we are getting false. And when we are trying to print the reference, when we are trying to print the memory address, that is we are getting the different memory address. So here we can come to the conclusion that these two references are pointing to the different instances. Okay guys, this is it for this tutorial. Thank you.